Everyone, thank you for your patience and your willingness to join Tevora for today's webinar, HITRUST 101, Keys to Certification Success. I'm Kevin Cutter. I work as a cybersecurity and compliance advisor for Tevora. I'm joined by John Huckabee, Managing Director of Tevora's Healthcare and ISO practices. Some of you on the line likely still get acquainted with Tevora. For those that don't know us, we are a nationwide information security management consultancy. We support several hundred services across 7 dedicated practices: threat management, cybersecurity framework compliance, data privacy, enterprise risk management, cloud, solutions, and incident response. Our practices have subsets such as John's healthcare and ISO practices. So very detail-oriented, very specific for how we conduct our business. Tevora was built 18 years ago to be among the best InfoSec consultancies in the marketplace. This has been achieved by taking into account direct feedback from the CISOs, CIOs, VPs, directors of security compliance, and the respective teams that we've worked with since our establishment back in 2003. Many of Tevora's principals and managing directors are former CISOs and CIOs, InfoSec veterans of both the private and public sectors. We uniquely approach information security, walking away from each engagement, leaving our clients in a better position, and always with something to build on. On the topic of today's webinar, HITRUST 101 Keys to Certification Success, know that we're allowing for questions. Please ask anything and everything. We'll address during the webinar real time, at the end, or in a follow-up email. Your dedicated Tevora rep will reach out with the recording and deck from today's session. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn you over to John so we can get started.
Great, thanks Kevin for the intro. Hi everybody, let's get started with the HITRUST intro and keys to successful certification. So I think Kevin kind of covered what Tevora is as a firm. You can learn more on our website, of course, at tevora.com. I myself, I'm the managing director of our healthcare cybersecurity and compliance practice. Been doing this for almost 2 decades. So it's a pleasure for me to kind of share my experience over those years. I've been involved with HITRUST for close to 8 years now. Where I was involved with HITRUST leadership at 2 different firms, and I lead the practice here, of course, at Tevora. Tevora's HITRUST practice, we've got over 100 clients now, and we have 100% client retention. So we're pretty proud of some of those facts, and we'll get into why Tevora has been successful in maintaining its HITRUST-based relationships. So a little bit about the HITRUST Alliance. HITRUST as an entity and as a framework organization was founded in 2007. They're based in Frisco, Texas. They're really the only universally recognized healthcare information security certification. And HITRUST is governed by a board of directors made up from leaders throughout the healthcare industry. One other thing I would say about HITRUST before we get to this next slide is that it's really healthcare focused. At least that was its mission from the outset. They are looking to expand into other verticals to not be just a healthcare specific certification. However, that's really been the foundation of HITRUST and continues to be the vast majority of at least the HITRUST work that Tevora does, is really healthcare vertical or healthcare vertical related in terms of business associates. So let's talk a little bit about why organizations are seeking HITRUST certification. I think the most common reason given is that they're a business associate of a covered entity and they're being required to be certified so that that covered entity is comfortable with the security and compliance posture of that business associate. So there are a lot of covered entities out there, very large ones, that are mandating HITRUST certification for those business associates that may be managing their PHI data. Some organizations choose HITRUST just because it's a comprehensive control framework that helps better secure their environments. In my opinion, it's one of the most comprehensive frameworks out there. You'll see what I mean by that when we go over the 19 domains of HITRUST. But it really does a good job of hitting a lot of the areas, if you will, that address information security risk. So, I would add to that, it's really been tailored over the years and is customized based on healthcare data breach information. And so they're trying to maintain a framework that's addressing the modern day breaches and the risk, the root cause analysis to those breaches and what risks are associated with those breaches. So it's really kind of a living organism, unlike some other frameworks that, you know, there's a static set of requirements. They may have been put in place 15 years ago. They're not really kept up to date. So that's another reason why organizations are attracted to the HITRUST framework. Lastly, and we see this with a lot of startups or even kind of the medical device space, it could be a differentiator for your service or product. And so a lot of times we'll have organizations, nobody has required that they be certified, but they want to get certified so they can have that HITRUST stamp of approval for their sales and marketing team, so that they can give assurance during the sales process, hey, our product is even HITRUST certified. You should use us. Our competitors aren't, that sort of thing. So we see that from time to time as well. So I'd say those are the three most common reasons, but certainly they're not the only reasons. One thing, before we get to the next slide, there is a questions functionality within the GoToWebinar. I'll be answering those questions throughout. So feel free to input your questions if anything comes up. So let's talk a little bit about how HITRUST is different than perhaps some of the other frameworks. Maybe AICPA SOC 2 framework, you may be familiar with that. The PCI data security standard for credit card data. You know, there are a host of other frameworks, NIST, et cetera, ISO 27001. What these boxes aim to describe is how HITRUST is different from many, if not all of those frameworks. So the first one is that HITRUST leverages an online web app called MyCSF. That's used to facilitate the assessment process and the certification process throughout the life cycle. And it's also used to maintain certifications in the form of interim assessments in year 2. So there's an online web app. It's called MyCSF. It's something that you'll have to pay to be a subscription or what we call a one-time object purchase. Either way, HITRUST, how they operate or how they make money is they charge an annual fee to organizations for access and for the use of that MyCSF. So that's a key differentiator. It's the only framework that I'm aware of that operates primarily through this web application. So a pretty big differentiator there. The next one is both HITRUST approved assessor and the entity being assessed are required to interact with MyCSF. So not only Tevora as your potential assessor is submitting the assessments on your behalf, which is required by a third party for HITRUST, but also the assessee will be interacting in MyCSF as well. So there's a dual interaction and kind of a teamwork approach, if you will, to completing the certification. And all the while, we are interacting with the HITRUST Alliance through that web application. I mentioned that there's a fee structure that is separate from the third-party assessor fee. So this is the same for all assessors, for every HITRUST assessment. Both there are fees associated for organizations like Tevora that are your validated assessor, which is required for certification, and there are also fees associated with paying that subscription fee to HITRUST for the MyCSF access. So just something to keep in mind. Like I said, other frameworks, there's no kind of dual fee structure. This is unique to HITRUST. The fee to HITRUST is relatively low, just as food for thought. We don't really get into quoting what HITRUST prices are. We try to steer clear of that as assessors. But certainly HITRUST is very transparent about what their cost structure is, and you can reach out to the HITRUST Alliance directly, or you can reach out to Tevora offline, and we can give you a ballpark figure of what HITRUST will charge you. But it's typically, in the $5,000 to $10,000 range per year. This next box here, HITRUST audits the auditor on 100% of assessments, no shortcut. This is a big differentiator for HITRUST. A lot of other certifications or attestations, there's not a third party involved. So for example, PCI Data Security Standard, AICPA SOC 2, probably two of the more common ones out there. There's not a third party auditing the auditor for quality. That's exactly what does happen with the HITRUST Alliance. So Tevora, as your assessor, would submit the certification, all of the evidence, all of the justification, the testing approach for the audit, et cetera, and then HITRUST has a QA function that QAs all of that work to make sure that everything is accurate and that the organization qualifies for certification. ISO 27001 and some of the other ISO frameworks is the only other standard that's kind of widely accepted, if you will, that has a similar process. So somewhat unique to HITRUST. Unique scoring for assessment. HITRUST has a very specific scoring mechanism. So again, unlike some of those other frameworks that I've been talking about, HITRUST has a very prescriptive mathematical approach to computing whether or not you can be certified. In short, there are 19 domains. Each of those domains need to score greater than 62% for an organization to be certified. So how you get to that 62%, there's a very prescriptive way, and I have a few slides that speak to that at a high level. Lastly, control set is unique to each organization. Again, a big difference between HITRUST and almost every other framework. There are a series of questions that organizations fill out in the HITRUST MyCSF. We refer to them as the admin details and factors. When you respond to those questions, after you responded to all of those questions, you press a button and it spits out what your requirement set will be. And that requirement set is specific to how you answered those questions, so specific to your organization. So like I said, Tevora does, we work with hundreds of HITRUST clients. Almost all of them have a unique requirement set. So you can't just Google HITRUST requirements and figure out what the requirements are for your organization. You actually have to go through this very prescriptive process to determine what your requirements are. That, in addition to that, your third year, when you're up for full recertification, you redetermine what your requirement sets are. So your requirement sets will potentially change depending on the changes to those factors and other factors such as HITRUST version, which can impact your requirements as well. So those are the big items that really stand out in terms of what's different between HITRUST and some of those other frameworks. So a little bit on the framework, and I kind of alluded to this earlier. There are 19 HITRUST domains in MyCSF, and don't worry, we're going to get to what those 19 domains are. Each of those domains has multiple requirements that are individually scored. So on average, I think the median number is somewhere around 300. There are 300 requirements dispersed amongst those 19 domains. Each domain has multiple requirements that are individually scored. Each domain requires a composite score of 60%, 62%. It's really greater than 62% actually for certification. And each requirement is scored against 5 maturity categories. And we'll get to what those categories are. The number of requirements, as I mentioned, can vary greatly. So we just submitted a validated assessment for one of the state of New York health exchanges, and they had a ballpark of 800 requirements. So that is the record in terms of Tevora is concerned. We've never seen a validated assessment with that many requirements. But like I said, the median is 300. So you can see how the number can greatly vary based on different factors, based on different requirements that your organization might have. In the case of the New York Health Exchange, the state of New York had a lot of very prescriptive requirements for those health exchangers. So that amped up the number greatly. Let's go to the next slide here, and we'll get into more about what some of those means. Here are those maturity categories that I mentioned: policy, procedure, implemented, measured, and managed. So this screenshot is directly from the HITRUST Alliance. You can see it's a little fuzzy. So those are the 5 categories, and I think in the next slide here, we get to, there we go. Those are the 5 categories: policy, process, implemented, measured, and managed. Here you can see that policy is worth 15%, process or procedure is worth 20%, implemented 40%, measured 15%, and managed 10%. So there's a different weight to each of these categories. So for example, if each of the 300 requirements is measured these 5 different ways. Is there a policy for the requirement? Is there a process or written procedure for the requirement? Has the requirement been implemented? Is the output of the requirement measured? And are those measurements managed? So a very prescriptive approach, again, very unique to HITRUST. So you can see there's a lot of detail. Without going down the rabbit hole, typically for year 1, we concentrate on those first 3 areas and ignore measured and managed. And HITRUST will even give out this same guidance, as measured and managed is very difficult to achieve, particularly for organizations that are maturing their InfoSec environment. And you can get certified just concentrating on those first 3 maturity categories. So I would say roughly 99% of our HITRUST clients only evaluate those first 3 maturity categories. But those are the 5 maturity categories that each of the requirements can be evaluated by. So let's go back up. So as you can see, there's a differentiation between the current weights and the updated weights. So at the time the screenshot was taken, HITRUST had not implemented the changes to the weights of each category, but this was implemented this year. So policy was decreased from 25% to now it's only worth 15% of the requirement score. And you can see the differences between procedure, implemented, measured, and managed. So what this graphic really depicts is HITRUST made a change to its methodology, and this graphic depicts what those changes are. They wanted to put more weight primarily on the implemented. So you see that going from 25 up to 40, and then less weight put on policy and procedure. So that is important for those of you that may have gone to a HITRUST training 4 years ago and you weren't aware that these changes were made, or maybe you were working with another organization that had been under the new or under the old methodology, but you weren't aware of the new methodology. So we wanted to include that in our presentation here. I'm not going to go through the details of this, and this presentation and this audio recording will be made available to all of you that follow up with Tevora. But as you can see, the main point of this slide is HITRUST gives us assessors a very specific, what we refer to as the scoring rubric, or approach to scoring each of the requirements. So it's so specific that out of my HITRUST assessor team, I only allow for our lead assessors to have a minimum of 2 years of experience, because it takes some time to kind of master the scoring rubric to be in tune or aligned with the HITRUST Alliance. So you can go through the details of this on your own, but just know that HITRUST, the point of this slide is that HITRUST is a very specific scoring mechanism that our assessors follow, and we follow it to the letter of the law, and HITRUST enforces it with their QA function. when we submit a assessment for certification, they'll say, you know what, we think you guys scored this one a little high. We're going to bump this score down to 50. We have those conversations, and all assessor firms have those conversations with HITRUST on a consistent basis. So it's very important to have an experienced assessor firm, an experienced assessor to accurately score the assessment. This is one of the largest reasons why we don't recommend organizations try to prepare for HITRUST on their own. It's almost always a recipe for failure, or at least for delay or cost overruns. It's a lot more efficient or effective to use an assessor firm, a noted assessor firm like Tevora, to walk you through the preparation for HITRUST certification because of this level of detail. It's almost impossible without assessor experience to do this accurately and to prepare your organization for certification. So that is a little bit on the scoring rubric. Let's go ahead and continue here. So here are the 19 HITRUST domains that I referenced. You'll see that if you're familiar with information security and compliance, there really shouldn't be anything new. Information protection, endpoint protection, portable media, mobile device, wireless configuration management, vulnerability management, network protection, transmission protection. That's typically, are you encrypting your data in transit? Password management, access control, audit logging and monitoring, education, training and awareness, third-party assurance, incident management, business continuity and disaster recovery, risk management, physical and environmental security, and of course, data protection and privacy. So those are all concepts that I'm sure most of you are familiar with if you've been in the information security game for some time. What I will speak to at a high level is some of the more difficult domains to manage. So mobile device and portable media. Those are two that are a little tricky because they're small domains. What we mean by that is there's only, you may only have 5 or 6 requirements associated with each of those domains. I think mobile device is closer to 10 now on your average. But what that means is when there's fewer requirements associated with the domain is there's less wiggle room to score lower on a specific requirement. So for example, let's say portable media security only has 4 requirements. If you fail just one, or if you don't implement just one, there's a good chance that will prevent you from being certified. So something, a pro tip, if you will, pay attention to those domains that have fewer requirements. They tend to be the ones that can prevent organizations from having scores that allow them to be certified. A couple of other domains that I'll talk about here. Third-party assurance you see down here. That is really the are you putting in the proper contracts in place with third parties to assure that they're taking care of your data? Are you monitoring service level agreements with your third parties? That sort of thing. Most organizations do not have formal processes for managing that, especially medium and small sized businesses. So that tends to be one of the areas that requires quite a bit of work prior to certification. Configuration management on the technical side. So this is how are you actively managing the configuration of your servers and endpoints. Again, smaller companies don't really have the budget to have a configuration management tool. A lot of those tools that are well known out there that manage server configurations actively or proactively. There are manual ways to get around it. Tevora certified all of its clients that have come to it seeking certification. So these aren't mountains that can't be climbed. But I just wanted to point out, some of the tougher domains. Third-party assurance and configuration management certainly kind of stick out. So yeah, that's just kind of a quick overview of domains and a little bit of insight on some of the domains to watch out for as you begin to tackle HITRUST. A little bit about our methodology, as I mentioned, 100% client retention. We've never lost a HITRUST client. We did have one client leave us for a year because they got a new CIO in place. That CIO wanted to go with an existing relationship that he had prior to joining the firm. Guess what? They came back to us a year later. So we really pride ourselves on client retention and valuing relationships. Tevora, we don't market ourselves, so if you haven't heard of Tevora, that's not surprising. But in the InfoSec world, most people know about Tevora. We just don't market. We've grown organically. And the reason why we've been able to grow organically without big marketing budgets is because of our relationships. And I think one of the reasons why we have the relationships that we do is because of this methodology, for example. So our HITRUST methodology is pretty straightforward, but I'll talk a little bit about why it's different than what other assessor firms may do. We perform a gap assessment that takes about a month. What we do is we A, determine what your HITRUST requirements are, and then B, ascertain where your gaps are and provide recommendations on how to address those gaps so that you can prepare for certification. It usually takes about a month, sometimes 3 weeks, sometimes 2 months. It varies just based on the organization's complexity and availability. I think our biggest differentiator in the gap assessment space is we only use very experienced assessors. There are some assessor firms out there that will use junior assessors. You might not get the level of detail that you need in terms of what your gaps are and how to remediate them efficiently. Our experienced assessors are professionals at that. We only use our most experienced professionals for the gap assessments because it's such a critical phase to understand what your gaps are and how to remediate them. The next phase, remediation, is probably our biggest differentiator. So unlike a lot of other audit firms are that kind of just go through the checklist, tell you what the gaps are, and they say, okay, fix these, and we'll be back in 6 months to certify you. That's not what Tevora does. As you may have noticed with Kevin's overview presentation of Tevora, we're a comprehensive security consultancy. So what that means is we do everything. We have Splunk implementers, we have cloud security experts, cloud security engineering, et cetera, policy and procedure templates. There's a slew of services that we provide to help our clients get through its remediation. A lot of our competitors don't do that. They don't want to roll up their sleeves, get their hands dirty. It's some of the reasons for that is it's difficult. It takes very experienced consultants to really be hands-on with remediation. Another reason is those projects are a little bit more difficult to manage, and they can be less profitable. So a lot of our competitors don't do that. But what we learned is that when we roll up our sleeves with our clients, they're our clients for life. So that's why we provide that service. It's a big differentiator for Tevora versus our competitors. Remediation on average, it's about 3 to 6 months for most organizations, just depending on basically what their bandwidth is, also what their budget is. If their budget is, okay, Tevora, we want to spend X amount of dollars to have you help us do the remediation. The size of that budget can impact the speed because obviously we're professionals, we do it very efficiently. Whereas if organizations do it on their own, it'll take a little bit longer. We work with all budgets and approaches, so we customize our remediation style to your organization's budget and to your needs. Some organizations have plenty of money and budget, and they really just want to offload it onto us. We're happy doing that too. So we'll take either approach. We just want to put our clients in the best position so that they get to the point to where they're certified. The next phase is the validated assessment here in the 3-step approach. But before we get to the validated assessment, it's important to note that there is a 90-day mandatory and what is referred to as a holding period, or what some other frameworks refer to as an audit period. So it's kind of a freeze period of 90 days where the newly implemented policies, procedures, and controls are required to demonstrate that they're operating effectively. So in between that remediation arrow and the validated assessment arrow, there's a 90-day period. So keep that in mind when you're thinking timeline. And certainly if you work with Tevora, we put together a detailed timeline at the beginning of each engagement, so everybody's, so there's complete transparency on what the timelines are. But it's something to keep in mind that this slide doesn't depict. The validated assessment takes about 4 months from finish to end. About 1 month for Tevora to actually perform the validated assessment and submit. And the reason why it takes 4 weeks is because, again, on average 300 requirements. Each requirement is evaluated 3 major ways: policy, procedure, and implemented, as a reminder. And each of those 900 or so evaluations or scores requires a piece of evidence. So you can imagine 900 pieces of evidence. There's a lot of upload there. It just takes a lot of time to accurately score those for us, the assessor. That sounds like a lot to you. That might sound like, hey, that's way too much, but trust us, we've gotten all of our organizations through it. At the end, they say, oh, that was less work than we thought. Thank you, Tevora, for making this efficient for us. So certainly, it's nothing to be concerned about, but it does take us a little bit of time, more so on the assessor side, to evaluate and upload all of that information into the MyCSF. Once Tevora has completed its submission, then it goes into the HITRUST queue, where HITRUST QAs it, provides feedback to the assessor on scoring, and then eventually they perform a comprehensive QA. It usually takes, depending on the time of year, right now is the peak season, so it could take up to 4 months this time of the year. But if we do it in the middle of the year, it might take 1 month. So there's a little bit of variance on how long it takes the HITRUST Alliance to get through their quality assurance piece and the issuance of the report. But I would say anywhere from 1 to 4 months. That's the range we're looking at. So if we're doing a quick timeline recap, about a month for the gap assessment, 3 to 6 months for remediation, 3 months for the holding period, and anywhere from probably 2 to 5 months for the validated assessment and certification issuance. So you can tell that we're looking in kind of that 10 to 12 month range from start to beginning, typically, for HITRUST certification. So that's just a little bit on the methodology and the timeline. So some keys to being successfully certified, and I've certainly already alluded to some of those. Use an experienced HITRUST CSF assessor. I cannot emphasize that enough. So many organizations come to us and said, you know what, we sent someone to the HITRUST Alliance for training. We thought we could do it on our own. We realized we're in over our head. Now we're 6 months behind. Can you help us out? Don't fall into that trap. My experience, whether or not it's Tevora or not, use a reputable, experienced assessor to help you navigate the process. I've shared some of the detail with you. There's even more detail that I haven't shared with you on the assessor side, because I didn't want to put you guys to sleep. But it's really nearly impossible for an organization to do it on their own. Be aware of HITRUST version updates, timelines, and control population variation. So HITRUST, as I mentioned, HITRUST framework is a living organism. It updates its requirement set annually and makes changes to the methodology from time to time. And I've shared some of those changes with you here today. A common mistake is an organization will determine what their requirements are, and they'll assume that they'll have that same requirement set 2 to 3 years down the road. That's not the case. You can typically lock in a requirement set through various mechanisms for about a year with HITRUST. If you purchase a subscription, for example, and create an object, you can use that object for a year without trying to get into the technical jargon here. You can lock in, quote unquote, a requirement population for your organization. But that usually expires and the controls will change. So just be aware of that. Work with an assessor to understand what the ramifications are for version updates, which changes the control population and other timelines and factors that might change your requirements. So it's the requirements change, and that's kind of a key takeaway that you should take from this. It's not a static requirement set such as HIPAA security rule or AICPA's SOC framework or the PCI data security standard, et cetera. Those are all static frameworks that, for the most part, those requirements don't change significantly. I think PCI, for example, has like a 3-year cycle. And the AICPA over the years, they do make some adjustments with the trust service principles, but by and large, those are largely static frameworks. HITRUST is not a static framework. You want to get your requirement set established accurately and as soon as possible. And what I mean by that is the sooner you know what your requirements are, the sooner you can begin working against becoming compliant with those requirements. That's always just food for thought. Most of the organizations that come to us we have to be certified by the end of the year, or we need to be certified in 9 months in a bad situation, et cetera, et cetera. So understanding what your requirements are and determining those requirements accurately is very important. Again, it usually takes a skilled assessor to get there. Another recommendation is to purchase the annual MyCSS subscription. The purpose of this webinar isn't necessarily to promote the HITRUST Alliance, although we are partners with the HITRUST Alliance, and we've had a great relationship over the years. But HITRUST gives organizations 2 options. You can purchase a one-time object, or you can purchase a subscription. The one-time object only gives you 90 days of access to MyCSS. The subscription gives you year-round access and comes with a lot of other benefits. If your organization can't afford it, we suggest the subscription. It erases a lot of the headaches for organizations that are seeking certification. The last recommendation here, assign requirement owners. So as I mentioned, the median number of requirements for organizations is around 300. Project management for that many requirements is critical. So a basic project management step is to assign owners to each of the requirements and responsibilities, kind of that project management 101 type stuff. Keep that in mind as you begin to approach remediation. Of course, if you use Tevora, we have tools in place that we've evolved over the last 8 years that help clients navigate that process. So, make sure that whatever assessor you use has those types of tools. Okay, so that's kind of the first slide on keys. Let's go to the second one. Oh, I have a typo. Perfect. Effectively document all procedures and policies. So what I mean by that is I mentioned that the 2 maturity categories, policy and procedure for each requirement. Those are basically kind of 3 points. That's how we kind of look at it as assessors and how you should look at it as an assessee. Get a score of 100 on policy and procedure. That's probably one of the best pieces of advice an assessor can give you to ensuring that you get that minimal domain score by domain. Of course, you have to implement most of the requirements, but it's critical to knock out the policies and procedures. Again, work with your HITRUST assessor on how to get a 100 for procedures and policies. Some of the tricks of the trade are keep those separate. Understand that procedures are very different than policies. They're not something that should be commingled. Procedures need to have the who, what, when, and how. That's what we refer to it as. And policies need to be a shall or will statement that address all of the specifics of the requirement. Tevora has procedure examples from previously certified environments that we provide nearly free of charge, policy templates, which is something that most assessor firms, but we provide it on a very efficient, cost-effective basis, again, to kind of establish that relationship. And again, it's something that we recognized 8 years ago. If you don't do that for the clients, they really struggle with that piece. That it's critical, nonetheless, to score close to perfect on those maturity categories. Establish a strategy by domain. Remember that you don't have to be compliant with every single requirement. All that's required is that you score a greater than 62% by each of those 19 domains. It's a maturity model framework. So when we say strategy by domain, what we mean is there may be some requirements that are impossible for your organization to comply with. It may be cost prohibitive. It may be operationally impossible. You can, what we call, punt on those requirements as long as the rest of the requirements in that domain have a high enough score to get you to the 62%. So work with an experienced assessor to have a strategy on what you can punt on and what you can't punt on, for example, because most organizations do not score perfect on all 300 requirements. As a matter of fact, I don't think I've seen it. So it's just something that's very difficult to do. So understand that there's a strategy behind the math, and your assessors can help work with you on that. Certainly our Tevora assessors are skilled at that. Keep your requirement set limited to the minimum possible the first year. HITRUST gives you a lot of opportunities to add additional frameworks on top of the HITRUST requirements. So for example, if your core requirement set had roughly 300 requirements, you can add on PCI requirements. That might add another 80 requirements. You can add on the HIPAA security rule and privacy rule. That might add on another 80. Before you know it, like the New York Health Exchange that we worked with, you're up to 800. And that's an extremely tall task for any organization to manage, no matter what size, no matter what the resources are. So our position is, so Tevora, try to keep it to the minimum the first year as you're tackling this. So once you get more comfortable with HITRUST, you've gone through the certification process, you can begin tackling some additional requirements. Lastly, use Tevora to both help prepare your organization and certify your organization. I talked a lot about Tevora. The relationships are 100% retention. I think we're the best in the business. I think our client references, our client retention, our reputation in the marketplace has, and that might be why many of you are in this webinar, but I think that speaks for itself. So I'm not going to say much more about it. Our value proposition, policy templates, procedure examples, strategic remediation. We provide an executive summary. So a lot of the detail that we provide in the gap assessment is spreadsheet based because there's so much detail. But we also provide a PowerPoint presentation that we customize for organizations because they kind of need that C-suite or board of directors level of communication. So that is also something that we've evolved over the years and will provide as part of the gap assessment. And we can provide updates throughout if required. Again, we're a solution provider, so there is no information security or HITRUST requirement task that we can't help out with. If it's writing a business continuity plan, if it's implementing a SIM or a logging solution, pen testing, you name it, we do it. I already spoke to Satisfact, customer sat, and value relationships, and our experience. We are an original HITRUST assessing firm. As a leader of this practice, I've been an official HITRUST assessor for 8 years. There's a picture. You can reach out to me directly or to Tevora. Our contact information is on our website. Another piece of advice, we have other webinars on our website in the healthcare space. We have a HIPAA one, for example. We have articles that we've written over the years that may be helpful if you're just getting into compliance areas. We have ISO 27001 webinars, privacy webinars, GDPR webinars. I mean, you name it, we have an expert group that addresses those areas. So go to Tevora.com if you want to learn more about any areas. Any questions that I can answer?
Yeah, John, I appreciate that. And thank you everyone for your time. There was a few questions that came in that are likely going to be relevant to the group. One of them you actually may have addressed already during your presentation from what I heard, but I'd rather err on the side of caution. So this question was, what is the timeline for the MyCSF assessment? How long Alliance response for certification?
So as I mentioned, the typical timeline from gap assessment until you receive the certification in hand, usually around 10 to 11 months. That being said, from the time that we submit the certification, so that what is referred to as the validated assessment, it takes your assessor typically about 4 weeks to process that. Again, there are various factors. It could take up to 8 weeks sometimes. But on average, 4 weeks to submit it to the HITRUST Alliance via the MyCSF. And then I would say on average about 3 months for processing until you receive the report and the certification. So depending on where your timeline is, or where your starting point is, that's the timeline. What else, Kevin?
Would being on AWS mitigate any of the risk associated with HITRUST?
You broke up a little there, Kevin. Can you
apologize?
Yeah.
Would being on AWS mitigate these risks? And I'm assuming that's around HITRUST.
Yeah. So Amazon Web Services. So actually, probably the most common architecture for HITRUST certifications. I would say roughly half of our certifications involve AWS as a cloud hosting provider. So it does. What we do is, so like, for example, physical and environmental controls. If you're using AWS, we're relying on the AWS SOC 2 Type 2 report for certain physical and environmental controls, such as, anti-fire or, physical, like, protections against physical access to the servers. Obviously, your organization is not going to be responsible for that. AWS is responsible for that. So we rely on their SOC 2 Type 2, and that does a couple of things. It reduces the number of requirements that you need to work on, basically, because they're addressed by AWS SOC 2 Type 2. And it also gives, if you're using a very common cloud hosting provider, it gives the HITRUST Alliance comfort that you're using a secure environment. So certainly there are some distinct advantages to using AWS. We at Tevora, we try to be hosting provider agnostic. We have relationships with all of them, giving our broad client portfolio. We work with over 1,000 companies over the years and partner with lots of companies, of course, over the years. But AWS is certainly one of the best ways to become HITRUST certified if you're using a cloud hosting provider. And like I said, the majority of our clients getting certified are using AWS. So very common platform and framework that we're used to seeing. Anything else, Kevin?
Yeah, one additional question, I think, before we wrap. What are the main changes to the HITRUST CSF, taking into account the June release of version 9.4?
Yeah. So some of the major changes, 9.4 really didn't change the requirements too much. It created a small delta for some of our organizations coming from like 9.1. So you'll have a small delta in requirements, maybe like, I want to say less than 10 requirements on average. So you'll have like some new requirements. Some of your old requirements may have gone away. We've seen that too. So there's a small delta in requirements. Since that release too, the admin details and factors have changed. So those questions that determine what your requirements are, those have been updated. I think that those are the major changes with 9.4. Relatively minor, but the change in the admin details and factors has been very helpful to assessors and assessees, because some of those new questions actually eliminate what were formerly not applicable requirements or designated as NA. So that's really kind of increased the efficiency of the assessments as well as the QA process. So that was a pretty positive outcome these past 6 months.
Great.
All right. Well, wanted to thank everybody for joining Tevora's HITRUST webinar. If you need any more details, feel free to contact Kevin or myself, kcutter@tevora.com, jhuckabee@tevora.com, as I'm sharing on my screen here. We're more than happy to help you out achieving your HITRUST certification or any other compliance frameworks that you're looking to tackle in the upcoming year. Have a great holiday season, everyone, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks, everyone, for your time. Bye-bye.